Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to part 1 of 3 of the Creating an Active Transportation Plan webinar series. My name is Paula Hyman from the Ohio LTAP Center. Before we begin today, I want to cover just a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions throughout this pod, presenter will address your question. So if it's pod, just type a quick hello, hey, how you doing, good afternoon, whatever suits you today. We're going to just take attendance for all 3 days. That's done automatically when you log in to GoToWebinar. Those qualified attendees at the end of the 3-day series will be sent certificates from our office. There's nothing in addition that you'll need to do. Those items are all covered, and with that, I'll thank you in advance for your participation. And I'm going to pass things off to Ms. Julie Walcroft, Senior Planner with Tool Design Group. Julie?
Thank you, Paula. I appreciate that. Welcome, everyone, to our first day of our Creating an Active Transportation Plan webinar series. As Paula said, my name is Julie Walcroft, Active Transportation Academy instructors. We're going to have a different instructor for each day. So you're going to automatically, like Paula said, you'll automatically receive a certificate for reporting credit. The actual presentation, an agenda for today. Today, we're going to have our introductions. We're going to overview the transportation planning process. We're going to talk about development and then what your future needs will be. And we're going to talk about a lot of different ways to get to these 4 simple steps. They look simple anyhow. So the active transportation through education PA is free to communities throughout Ohio and any local jurisdiction and its planners, engineers, parks and recs departments, public health affiliates, decision makers, leaders, volunteers, residents, etc. They're all welcome to participate. And professional development credits are available for attendees to self-report in-person trainings and pre-registered with the APA for AICP credits for in-person trainings, which will hopefully begin happening again at some time in the near future. And they're focused on train the trainer, bicycle and pedestrian related planning and safe routes to school activities. Workshops are focused on assisting a community to develop their active transportation plan or Vision Zero action plan. Communities are welcome to request a host of different types of training, and ODOT will work with communities to organize those workshops. E-learning offerings to some of the other. If you want to consider participating in a training or hosting a training or want to know more in general, please contact either Kate Harley at ODOT or Amelia Mansfield from Burton Planning Services. And there's also information on the LTAP Local Transportation Assistance Planning website and the walk.ohio.gov website. And the goals of this series: active public engagement method, tools, and resources. And we're going to be using a program called Menti. If you haven't used it before, you can either open a new tab or go to your phone and go to menti.com, and that will open up a question for you, which I'm having a hard time navigating here. Sorry. Excuse me. Okay. And that will open a question for you, and you can put in some information such as to let us know basically who you are. We want to know what your name is, where you work, and what type of work you do. So it looks like so far we have a very large contingent for our local and with ODOT and another rather kind of equaling things out. We've had 21 replies so far, so keep them going through today. And happen to be working on active transportation. It's great. We have a lot to cover today. Oh, excuse me. We have another step in this. Now we want to know what it is exactly that you do. Sorry about that. So go back in and tell us. There we go. We got a lot. We're getting a lot of responses there today. And you can just type plan, general information, learn more about what goes into traffic planning, advice for a large city, someone wants to learn more, the transportation center to be more valuable, ATP, learn. I think we all got a pretty good feel for who each other are, and we're going to have just a couple of more Menti questions as we go on. The AT planning process. If you've done other community, because I'm going to, and then there'll also be a little bit of time at the end. But speaking of questions, think about developing an active transportation plan. Think of it, it's really all about questions. It's figuring out the right questions to ask, asking those questions, and using the answers to those questions along with collected data and community priorities to develop a valuable AT plan for your community. Your participation, hiking, and those start by answering these questions through here, reading the questions to you. Or no, actually go to Menti right now. I'm sorry about that. Go back to menti.com and use that code again, 5010752. And I'm going to read to you some things to think about as you're answering the questions, and then I'll show you those questions. So planners like to use this graphic to illustrate all the different types of built environments that we live in, and it's called a transept. And it's divided into separate zones that range from urban centers and downtown cores, all the way out to rural and natural zones. But we're not going to get into quite that much detail today. Instead, we're going to talk about the broad context. We're going to talk specifically about the rules to look at. A little bit of an issue transferring it over. Paula, is it possible for you to help me with that? It's not Okay, so, okay. So let's talk about the jurisdiction that you're planning for. Like we said, we have people planning in this webinar, planning for a city, a township. I don't think we saw any villages, but we did see quite a few combinations. And you want to think about who needs to support the plan. Is the jurisdiction one with a mayor? Is the jurisdiction covered by a board, a city council? Do you have a city planner that you need to be including in this, or a city manager? Are you planning for an entire community or just part of it? That might also answer the question, is who needs to support this plan? Whether it's a master plan, a neighborhood plan, an area plan or corridor plan, or even a single site plan, the steps you take to develop the plan, they're all similar. However, the amount of information you gather will differ depending on the size of the community and the scope of the plan. The actual information won't differ, but the amount you have available for that scope may differ. So these are PO, like that. So for the has developed several of those that you use goals and strategies within that as well. Existing conditions, how to identify regional and local corridors and existing facilities, as well as gaps, barriers, generators, and other features of existing networks. How to develop socio-demographic community profiles and their impact on active transportation planning decisions. And the steps for conducting demand, need, crash, and equity analysis. And then, of course, there's community engagement, which is very important. And that talks about how to seek input from the public and stakeholders with a focus on innovative outreach strategies to underserved populations like marginalized racial and ethnic groups, immigrant communities, non-English speakers, LGBTQIA individuals, low-income individuals, differently abled individuals, etc. And then the recommendations should encompass how to develop a proposed bike and pedestrian network with local and regional routes, including connections to any statewide identified multimodal projects. For example, the state and US bicycle route system that ODOT has been working on for several years. And implementation, how to follow project prioritization, which is very important. with a focus on equity, to produce a prioritized project list with select conceptual designs, funding options, maintenance strategies, and implementation approach. And you're also going to want to make sure that you write into the plan that you're going to be revisiting this plan periodically to assure you are still meeting the needs of the community, because oftentimes the community needs do change and community priorities change. So you want to make sure you keep up with those. Most plans are developed using a process like this. Some of the steps, they may be revisited or duplicated during the process to ensure the greatest number of people can participate. We're going to talk about participation, and especially within the time of COVID, a bit tomorrow. But public participation should be a central part of each step. And it may be in the form of press releases, social media updates, website updates, or public meetings, or more creative and unconventional outreach strategies. You know, we have people who would normally be someone who kept up with the news and read a newspaper, but at this time they're at home doing their jobs and taking care of their children at the same time, so they might not have enough time to do that. So we're going to talk about strategies on how to make that happen in a little bit more detail tomorrow. So before we get into the vision and goals, are there any questions? Does anyone have any questions? Michael? Okay, so we'll have another stopping point later on. So if you do have questions throughout the presentation, make sure you put them in the chat box so we can get to them. So reading that with what you know. It's also in guidance documents. That's another place to look. For example, Ohio's Strategic Highway Safety Plan, or Walk Bike Ohio, Ohio's statewide bicycle and pedestrian plans. There will be a lot of information that you can use in those plans to kick off your initiative. So here's a few local examples to talk about. This is a local plan, and it's called Better Bike, and I think it's for Pittsburgh, but I'm not positive. But their goals are to improve safety, increase mode share, and lead with equity. And then achieve zero pedestrian and bicyclist fatalities by 2030. And so ODOT's statewide active transportation planning effort, it has a vision and goals that any jurisdiction can use to draft the vision and goals for active transportation in their own community. ODOT-funded local active transportation plans typically incorporate these goals. They allow for the community to incorporate additional goals based on community priorities. And the goals are based on these 6 topics: safety, equity, network connectivity, network utilization, livability, and preservation. And we're going to be talking about all of those things. Question. Discussion of transit gap analysis might be more important, but we are going to highlight a few different components. We're going to talk about local plans and policies, cultural and demographic environment, the natural environment, and the built environment. So look at the different types of plans. Actually, it's time to go into Menti again. And once again, the code is 5010752. And here we have a list of different types of plans that are available, that may be available in your community. And one of these might be able to help jumpstart the development of your AT plan, or they might be updated to incorporate active transportation. And so what I'd like you to do in Menti, let us know what kind of corridor study. Among others, we have neighborhood plans. Nearly every single type of plan is entered in here. Plan right now, I'm going to be working on all these types of plans. So, proposing any types of recommendations, it's critical to understand who is living in your community. what their transportation challenges are, as well as other issues that affect transportation, like housing, health, and employment. And the best way to do this is by talking to the people who live there and making sure their voices are reflected in the plan. Supplementing that engagement with other data provides a complete picture of the community's socio-demographic profile. For example, if you're working in a rural community with long distances between destinations and just a few transit options, it would be important to know the prevalence of zero vehicle households. Or if data shows that there's a high obesity rate in the community and there are no safe options for active transportation or recreation, those findings should inform your recommendations as well. The CDC Social Vulnerability Index is one way to examine a community's demographics. It measures the degree to which a community can prevent suffering and financial loss in the event of a disaster. The SVI assigns a composite score to every census tract based on factors like income, education, housing, and transportation. I apologize for that. Sorry about that. Many of these data are related to equity considerations, making sure that we're prioritizing our needs of the most marginalized and vulnerable in our communities. And we're going to talk about a little bit more about that in a moment. Here are some sources to start. The of the factors that affect in the ask if they're going to have questions or over, we'll give you access to the slides and so forth. So the natural environment sometimes gives us physical barriers. So rural areas often have not bad, but they have physical constraints that it's difficult to provide cost-effective transportation facilities. It's hard to work around those constraints. And you know, we do have some pretty serious terrain in the Appalachian part of the state, as well as rivers, highways, railroads, and much of a problem, but there are still areas where it's difficult to build for accommodating users of all ages and abilities. Wetlands and endangered species are challenging to overcome, though if you have proper planning and coordination with the associated regulators, it's often possible to develop a trail or something else that's minimally intrusive as far as part of your network is concerned. Here are some sources. Present and future. Is there development regulations like minimum lot size and setbacks to impact safety, comfort, and convenience of people walking and biking? Regulations can either help or hinder active transportation. Standards for minimum sidewalk width, walkway construction, and maintenance policies, requirements for bike parking will require developers to include these amenities. Picture here is bike parking requirements in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and their zoning code. Middletown, Wisconsin subdivision regulations require sidewalks to be built at the time of street construction rather than waiting until the houses are built, which ensures a complete sidewalk network from the beginning. And that's actually pretty important because sometimes those sidewalks don't get built. Often a reason the developer may not want to build them right away, their reasoning, I should say, I don't know if it's really a good reason, is because they're worried they'll get damaged during construction. However, they're not very expensive to repair during construction. So it's not really considered a valid excuse. So counting. It is an integral part of the equity issue, and it's a good resource for more information on equity. I briefly want to cover why it's important to include equity in our plans before explaining how to incorporate it into existing conditions analysis. So, you know, as we all know, transportation is a public good, and everyone should have access to the benefits of a safe and connected transportation system. Desperate, I can't say that word, access to mobility leads to social exclusion. I'm sorry. Desperate access means not everyone has the same ability to enjoy safe and connected travel because the system is designed to favor some groups over others. This perpetuates inequalities or inequities in access to food, healthcare, recreation, education, employment, and other essential needs and opportunities. Also, as we mentioned, it's required by law. The Environmental Justice Executive Order, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. Achieving planning goals requires it. So focusing resources on populations who have been traditionally underserved and who face the greatest challenges, it's critical in order to make significant progress on safety and accessibility. A need or existing conditions, inequitable transportation impact on benefits to low-income households, people of color, or other marginalized groups. Or a specific evaluation of displacement or similar trend that disproportionately impacts people of color and low-income households. An equity analysis, it can both identify populations that have experienced inequity and evaluate the impacts, what you're planning on those, evaluate impacts of what you're planning on how they would be on those populations to identify additional disparities. Think about why a specific demographic is included in an equity analysis. And when possible, explain why that demographic group is included. For example, is it because of historic inequities? Is it limited to access to resources? Is it disinvestment in community? Barriers to political influence? Those are all examples. And also, another thing to consider is to be careful not to conflate race with income. Although race and income are often linked, especially in cities, communities of color and low-income communities are two distinct populations, both of which require attention in equity analysis. When it's possible, decouple those variables to look at factors like race, ethnicity, car ownership, income, and language spoken at home individually. Avoid things like creating a single heat map that combines all of the variables. Different populations can have unique needs that can have distinct or compounding impacts in the study area. Make sure you're intentional about race in these analyses. As mentioned, different populations have unique needs. Distinct racial and ethnic populations also have unique needs and perspectives. When there's enough data to do so, disaggregate racial and ethnic groups. As part of its statewide bicycle and pedestrian plan, Walk Bike Ohio, ODOT performed an equity analysis for the entire state, and it created a composite equity score for every census tract in the state, with scores assigned based on the presence of racial and ethnic groups, youth, older adults, poverty, low educational attainment, limited English proficiency, and low motor vehicle access. So higher scores, they correspond to a higher presence of underserved groups, and they indicate a greater need to increase equitable outcomes. So this example is District 3, ODOT's District 3, and you can see that there's a lot of vulnerable populations in the cities, but also high levels of need in the rural areas. As part of the existing and how it's currently serving the community transportation system to understand how it currently functions and might function in the future. And first, we're going to talk a little bit about safety, then geometry of the roadways, bike ped facilities, and trip generations. So when you're thinking of these things, ask yourself questions like, how will a proposed active transportation system tie into the existing transportation system? Will the system increase access to stops if it includes transit? Will the facility reduce motorized traffic by allowing for safe experiences for pedestrians and bicycles? So over the past, navigating Ohio roadways by foot, and another between 09 and 18, Ohio saw 60 degrees. And looking at that data already 2017, it was the worst year for pedestrians in over a decade. A few quick takeaways about pedestrian safety trends in Ohio. High-risk behaviors have a huge impact on pedestrian safety within Ohio. For example, crossing mid-block with no signal or crosswalk, walking along the roadway at night, or texting while you're driving or walking. Severe pedestrian crashes disproportionately impact our high-need communities. Pedestrian fatality and serious injury crashes were most likely to occur on arterials of high-speed, high-volume roads. And arterials alone account for 54% of severe crashes. Yet, they only make up 7% of our total roadway network. So what you're seeing is significant risk. Given where and how arterials have been constructed and designed, they pose likely the largest danger of pedestrian safety within the state. Bicycle crashes, and while not as pronounced as pedestrian crashes, bicycle fatalities are also trending in the wrong direction. Nationally, while overall roadway fatalities declined 2.4% actually, we saw bicycle fatalities increase 6.3% and pedestrian fatalities increased 3.4%. Safety is the #1 planning and design imperative for transportation. And given these numbers, it's not surprising. How should you go about incorporating that information into your active transportation plan? Well, for rural communities, your active transportation plan. So there's many age, race, geographic information of crash victims and survivors, contributing factors like distracted driving, whether drugs or alcohol were involved, special circumstances, and whether it's in a work zone or a school zone or something like that. You have to make sure that you have as much of that information as possible. So TIMS, they're going to both allow you to drill down. I personally like the TIMS tool because it's easy to use. Much of what you will be looking for to develop a plan is pre-programmed for you in the map viewers section under active. And there you can search crashes, the state and US bike route system, and for your active transportation network. For example, how connected is the network to important destinations? Are different parts of the network well connected to one another? Can you get across town on a bike using a low stress route the entire way? Can you walk across town on comfortable, well-maintained sidewalks? Are your bike and pedestrian facilities accessible to all ages and abilities? Do they accommodate users with mobility or cognitive disabilities, youth, for example, or older adults? Are they comfortable and convenient? Do they have equitable distribution? Does your network serve communities that need it the most? People without vehicles, people who rely on transit, people of color and low-income people who walk and bike at greater rates than the general population? Are you asking those communities what types of facilities they need and what their priorities are? You may have some infrastructure that means we have white sidewalks, we have many people in Central Ohio crossings, separated bike lanes, for example, in these two images. Or crosswalks might be in disrepair, push button, not so effective examples. Now, you might have some infrastructure also that's in a bike boulevard, shows where the bicyclist should cross. It shows where the pedestrian has white sidewalks and curb extensions. So that has a lot of infrastructure. You may or may not need all of it depending on the issues in your particular community. And here's another example of a people parking, in the painted out bike lane. And there are 5, keep in mind there are 15 state bike routes in all 15 largest communities. Here are some places where you can get the digging into, one source, you'll be able to find other sources from there as well. Active transportation to be speeding up here a little, traffic management. And there is a section in MS2 that can be used for bicycle and pedestrian data. And you can go to odot.ms2 to soft. It can be used to corroborate conventional counts. And there are other sources of that type of data, like GPS data that's volunteered and Strava and so forth. But if you do want to use Streetlight, ODOT has a license, and if you don't already have it for your community, any community in Ohio can access it through ODOT. Now that you've looked at active transportation related improvements and projects, goals and existing conditions, tomorrow is about fundings and performance measures, and then you can be done. And today we had our introductions, we talked about the overview of the planning process, we talked about developing vision and goals and determining existing conditions. Tomorrow is going to be developing. So if there are any questions real quick, we do have just a few.
Right now, we don't have anything in the questions pod.
Slides themselves after the 3 presentations. Thank you.